Right. Well, I'd say we're probably okay to get started. In case you all missed it, my name is Jennifer Whip. I'm the Child and Youth Services Librarian here at Gravenhurst Public Library. We're excited to be hosting Alicia. She's the president of the International Dyslexia Association, and she's going to be presenting to us today on understanding dyslexia and reading development. So, welcome, Alicia, and thank you for being here. I'll pass it off to you.
Amazing. Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me to come in and speak today. I'm always excited to talk about dyslexia and to try to get information out to as many people as possible. As Jennifer said, I'm the president of the International Dyslexia Association, the Ontario branch. I've been in this role for 2 years now, and I started volunteering. It is a volunteer role. I started volunteering with IDA 4 years ago now. After I received help from IDA for my own child, learning how to assist him with learning to read. And I found that the information that they provided was really useful and helpful, and that was why I was inspired to start volunteering. So without further ado, we have a fairly short presentation, well, shortish presentation today, but we will have time for questions afterwards. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer those. So our agenda for the presentation, we're going to go over a basic definition of what dyslexia is. Then we're going to talk about some common myths about dyslexia, because there is a lot of misinformation about dyslexia floating around out there. Then we'll have just a brief discussion about the impacts of dyslexia. And then we are going to discuss the science of reading and what it says about how people learn how to read, as well as how we can help children succeed so that they can learn to read, all of them. So what is dyslexia? This is a very bare bones definition, but I think it pretty much sums it up. Dyslexia is a neurologically based condition that affects word level reading accuracy, reading fluency, and spelling. And it's sometimes or often described as an unexpected difficulty in learning to read. But this last part here, I really want to dig into this a little bit more because it's described as an unexpected difficulty in learning to read, not because that is something about dyslexia itself. It's more about common perceptions of how learning to read should work. So there is a common perception that children will learn to read fairly easily as long as they are immersed in the right environment, as long as they're raised in a household that's full of books and they have parents who read to them and take them to the library, that once those children who've been well supported and exposed at home, once they get to school, they should fairly easily pick up books and start reading them. So when we see children who've had those advantages and that experience and they get to school and they are not, and they don't pick up reading easily, we consider it unexpected. So often it's those children that end up getting referred to for assessments or who have parents who can take them out for an assessment to a psychologist. That assessment might come back as specific learning disability affecting reading. I've also seen it as specific learning disability in reading phonemics. There's a few different terms. But all of those terms, learning disability, if it's impacting word level reading, reading fluency and spelling, all of those things, it's an equivalent term for dyslexia. However, the sad truth is that there are a lot of children who, because of our common perception that reading should be fairly easy if you've been in the right environment, if there are biases about what we perceive that child's environment is, we might not be finding it unexpected that a child is struggling with reading. So this is where issues I'll just say it, racism and classism often seep in. So if we have a preconceived notion of this child isn't coming from a supportive environment and then they're struggling with reading, often their learning disability is overlooked, because we know that dyslexia actually affects everyone equally, regardless of background and regardless of level of intelligence. So dyslexia itself doesn't discriminate, but unfortunately there is a fair bit of discrimination in terms of who is getting diagnosed with dyslexia and who is not. And that is very problematic because all individuals who have dyslexia can equally benefit from the sorts of help and treatment. And so it should really be provided to all of them. So that is one of the sort of misconceptions. And this is why I think it's so very important that we talk about other common myths and misconceptions about dyslexia so that we can really break those down so that we can make sure that all children are getting the support that they need so that they can be successful. So I have selected 5 very common myths about dyslexia that I'd like to just go through and break down. The first myth is that dyslexia is rare or it doesn't even exist. So as I said in the beginning definition, dyslexia is a brain-based condition that is well documented. So there's been studies, many different types of studies from around the world, and scientists have identified that there are both functional and structural differences in the brains of individuals with dyslexia versus the brains of individuals who do not have dyslexia. So it's well documented that dyslexia is in fact a real thing. Unfortunately, of course, there are people who don't necessarily believe in science, but rest assured it is a real thing. And it is also the most common cause of reading difficulties. So the idea that dyslexia is rare is certainly not true. In terms of how common dyslexia is, it's very difficult to put a number on it. You'll see numbers floating around the internet, 10%, 20%, 15%. The reason that is that there are those different numbers out there is because dyslexia isn't a yes or no thing. The amount of difficulty that a person has with learning to read, it exists on a continuum. And so it simply depends on where you decide to draw the line to just say, well, this is dyslexia and this is just difficulty with learning to read. But most scientists would say that the prevalence of dyslexia is between 10 and 20%. The government of Ontario, the Ministry of Education's own estimate is 17%. But we know that the vast majority of people with dyslexia in Ontario are not diagnosed or supported. Currently, 8% of students have a diagnosis of a learning disability by the time they're in grade 10. And 80% of learning disabilities are, in fact, dyslexia. So that tells you that there are a lot of people out there that are not being supported for their dyslexia, but it is very common. The next common misconception about dyslexia is that dyslexia is a visual problem that causes people to see things backwards, to see words and letters jumping around the page. And this is, of course, a myth. This is not true. Dyslexia is not actually a visual issue. So individuals with dyslexia are no more or less likely to have a visual issue than anyone else. So there certainly are people that have visual stress issues. And individuals with dyslexia are no more or less likely than anyone else to have those sorts of issues. But I think the reason that this perception exists is because when we observe struggling readers read, their eyes do tend to jump around the page. But it's important to know that that is a byproduct of being a struggling reader rather than the cause of being a struggling reader. So we observed that when children are trying to read and they're having difficulty, they can't figure out what the word is. They're often looking around the page for other clues or other information that might help them figure out what the word is. As they become more successful and confident readers, they do that less, so the eye movement stops. So because of that association, there's been a lot of products and a lot of therapies developed for dyslexia, which are certainly well-intentioned, but they're minimally useful. So the idea of eye tracking training and these sorts of things are really not addressing the problem. What individuals with dyslexia need are help and instruction so that they can actually learn to read the words on the page. And once they can do that successfully, then the eye tracking issues tend to resolve on their own. The next myth, and I touched on this already, is that, if parents just read more to their kids, the kids will learn to read easily. And I brought this one up again because, it's absolutely important that parents read to their kids, but that is not enough to prevent dyslexia or to prevent the reading challenges that individuals with dyslexia have. But it's a harmful myth because it prevents a lot of parents from seeking help, because there's this notion that, oh, if my child is struggling with reading, I must have done something wrong. And that's absolutely not true. Reading to your child is important, but it won't prevent the reading challenges that are associated with dyslexia. So the only thing that will prevent the reading challenges that are associated with dyslexia are providing children with evidence-based structured literacy very early on, starting in kindergarten, and then providing them with a more intense intervention for the areas that they particularly struggle in. And then I think this is my final myth, is that kids with dyslexia are just lazy or they lack motivation. And the fact here is that, as I mentioned, dyslexia is a brain-based difference. So kids with dyslexia cannot just, muscle their way through and just figure it out on their own. They really do need help and support if they're going to be successful with reading. And they're often trying very hard, and they can become very frustrated and disengaged because they haven't been successful and they haven't received the support that they need. And unfortunately, this often ends up resulting in behavior. So either kids will act out, they might be the class clown, they might be disruptive in class, better to be the bad kid than be the stupid kid. Or some kids become very quiet and they turn inward on themselves. And it often manifests in kids in grade 3 and grade 4 as anxiety and depression. And it's very sad, but we know that there are a lot of kids who aren't having their dyslexia identified until they sort of reach a crisis point in grade 3, 4, maybe even 5. And then they're taken to a psychologist who will do an evaluation and then discover that the underlying issue is unsupported dyslexia. So, oh, and actually my final myth, sorry, I thought that was the final myth, but the final myth is that individuals with dyslexia cannot learn to read. And this is a really problematic idea that is out there. And I've experienced this stereotype myself with my own child after he received his psychoeducational assessment that showed that he has a severe case of dyslexia. I was told by the teachers and the principal at his school, actually, that not every kid is a reader. The best thing that we can do for him is to accommodate him, to get him kitted out with technology, to teach him how to use it, and that he can compensate with technology because his dyslexia is so severe that he won't learn to read. But the fact is that individuals with dyslexia of any age can learn to read if they receive appropriate instruction and support. Sometimes that instruction and support needs to be very intense if it's going to be effective. But with that instruction and support, they can learn to read independently. The best chance that children with dyslexia have is if they receive early identification and intervention. And when I say early identification, we can use screening tools now on children as young as 4 years old to, with 95% accuracy, identify which children are at risk for dyslexia. It's not a diagnosis, it's just a flagging for risk. And if we start to provide targeted reading instruction and targeted reading intervention to those kids when they're in kindergarten, over 95% of those kids will go on to be reading on grade level by the time they're in grade 2 or 3. And many of them will never actually even realize that they are struggling readers, because if you can get in there when they're in kindergarten, they can keep up with the other kids in the class rather than falling behind and trying to catch up. And that's really important, that early identification and early intervention piece. because it not only it provides the greatest chance for the child to be successful academically in school, it also helps to preserve their mental health, which is something that can't be, the value of that can't be overstated. Because the impacts of that early struggle with reading and the impacts of going on with lifelong low literacy, which I guess I should say, for children who are not reading on grade level by the time they're in grade 3, 70% of them currently are going on to having lifelong low literacy. It is very difficult for them to catch up. And the impacts of low literacy, I'm sure most of us are familiar with these ideas, but if you're reading is the key to everything. If you're not reading, your opportunities in education are very limited. That limits your choices for post-secondary or job opportunities, and your lifetime earnings, more likely to experience poverty and homelessness. But it also carries with it this much higher risk of experiencing mental health issues, including suicide. Individuals with dyslexia who are not supported, I've read, are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. It comes with reduced physical health outcomes as well as increased likelihood of becoming the victim of abuse, and having much higher risk for becoming involved in crime or becoming incarcerated. So there was a study by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police that found that 60% of inmates in the Canadian jails had 60% had less than grade 8 literacy skills. So obviously we need to do everything we can to prevent that. But the real tragedy is that all of this is really and completely unnecessary. So we know that with evidence-based instruction and early intervention, over 95% of kids can learn to read. So there's all of the information out there that we need to prevent this. It is a preventable tragedy that is happening. The problem is that a lot of this information hasn't yet made it into the education system. It's not being provided to teachers in Teachers College, unfortunately. In many cases, there's active resistance to arming teachers with this information, which I will talk a little bit about that later, because the Ontario Human Rights Commission is currently auditing all of Ontario's faculties of education to find out why they're not teaching teachers about the evidence base around reading development and the most effective ways to teach children and to assess children so they can help and intervene early.
We actually had a question from Denise in the comments about that, and she said that she heard that there is a human rights case against Ontario because partly we are failing children with these types of needs and rather providing technology instead of teaching them to read with the proper support and human resources. Any thoughts on this, and have you heard of the commission? So.
Oh yes, lots of thoughts on that, and yeah, I was involved with the original group that got that complaint going. So it's been going for 2 years now. It was officially launched in 2019. And I could talk about this all night. But what they have done, it's really interesting actually. So this slide that we're on right here is perfect to discuss this, because there is this evidence base. A lot of people call it the science of reading. And it's an accumulation of research about how people learn to read. And, we've got about over 50 years, like 5 decades worth of accumulated scientific research into how reading develops, right? And there are some findings at this point that have come out of that. When you have a large body of research, there are converging pieces of evidence that once they come together and once there's enough evidence from enough different sources, it's just accepted as this is just the way it is, right? And based on all of this, there are some themes that have emerged that say that we need to be providing all kids with 3 things, basically, is what we need to do to ensure that we can get 95% of kids reading. We need to be using systematic and explicit instruction in letter sound correspondence. We need to be teaching that starting in kindergarten to all of the kids. We need to be screening all of the kids for risk of reading failure. Dyslexia is one of the risk factors. And there's many different things you need to screen there. And then for all of the kids that are flagged through that screening, we need to be providing that early intervention. And so we brought all of that information to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and we brought the Ontario curriculum and the various policies around intervention and said, you know, we're not doing this. The way that we're teaching kids to read is based on an outdated philosophy of how reading works. We pointed to the specific parts in the Ontario curriculum around word reading and how kids are supposed to learn to read. I actually have those slides later in this presentation. And then we assembled stories from families who had all been told, no, it's best to wait. Like, let's just wait and see what happens with your child. We'll wait and see. And waiting and seeing is just a recipe for disaster, because if kids don't get that intervention before grade 1, most of them will never catch up. The later that intervention starts, the longer it needs to continue and the more intense it needs to be. The statistic there is when intervention starts in grade 4, it takes 4 times longer for kids to catch up than it does when intervention begins in grade 1. And because there are so many kids that are getting to grade 4 that need that intervention, and the intervention needs to be so much more intense, there's just a resource crunch, and schools simply can't provide that intervention at that intensity to all the kids that need it. So yes, they end up often pushing assistive technology out as the solution, and then we have kids that are being shuffled through that aren't reading. So the neat thing with the inquiry is that they have set up a set of benchmarks that they say are the framework for effective and equitable reading instruction. And that, it's 5 points. Here's all the things that school boards should be doing. And then they are actually auditing 8 Ontario school boards to see if they're following those benchmarks. And then, as I said, they're also auditing the faculties of education to find out why it is that they're not actually providing this information to teachers in Teachers College. Because a lot of the people that started that complaint were teachers, as I should say as well.
Are the benchmarks public on the site provided? Denise is asking.
Yes, absolutely they are. And if you're interested in knowing more about the OHRC inquiry, I should say, on our YouTube channel, which I don't know if you can send out the link to that, Jennifer, it would be on our website. But if you go to YouTube and you search for IDA Ontario, you'll find our YouTube channel. And on there, we had an update from the lead lawyers of the inquiry in the spring. And they go through all 5 benchmarks, and they give us, like, here's what we found so far. Like, so we have their preliminary findings and their anticipated recommendations. So they kind of go through each one of the 5 points, and they provide a lot of information about what they're actually seeing. And so it's very exciting. The only disappointing thing about the inquiry is that we were expecting that the full set of findings and recommendations would be coming out like in the next couple of weeks. But they literally just announced this afternoon that they're delaying their report until February. So that is very disappointing to me, but better late than never. So I think there's another question in the chat. Okay. Oh, great. It was just the YouTube channel. Okay, so I guess I should get back on track with the presentation, which is fine. So the science of reading, there's actually quite a lot of information here. It is absolutely fascinating. There's some really good books that you can dig into. Since there's a couple of teachers on the call, actually, I'm going to suggest a couple of specific books. There's a new one that just came out called The Art and Science of Teaching Reading by Christopher Such. And he goes through, it's a very readable book, and it's written by, he's a teacher. And so he really explains how to apply the science to the classroom. The other book that is really a fantastic read is called Language at the Speed of Sight by Mark Seidenberg. That's far more theoretical. It doesn't really give you the sort of hands-on information you might want to be able to apply it in the classroom, but it is a really interesting read as well. It's not a dry read. It's entertaining, but it's fascinating.
Sorry,
so obviously,
what was the title of the first book you just said?
The first book is called The Art and Science of Teaching Reading by Christopher Such. or maybe it's the Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading. You can get that one on Amazon. It's
Oh yeah,
it's not
Aileen's put it in the comments for us, I think.
perfect. Yeah, I would, if there's a teacher out there, I would recommend that one because it really does show you how to apply it in the classroom. So obviously in the space of this presentation, I can't quite go through everything of the science of reading because it is a vast and interdisciplinary body of research, but I do have some highlights that I think are useful both for parents that are trying to understand how they can support their child, and very useful for teachers trying to understand how they can support all of the kids in their class. So this diagram here is called the simple view of reading, and this is a model of reading that's been around since the 80s, but it's very, very referenced, often referenced in the research around reading, and it's been validated through a number of different studies as sort of an accurate reflection of what's going on with reading. So reading, obviously the goal, and everybody agrees that the goal is to get to reading comprehension. That's what we're trying to do, to create, understand what's on the paper. But there are two distinct parts of reading comprehension that both are equally important and both need to be in play so that we can get there. The first part is word identification, and that's just, being able to figure out what the squiggly lines say and to be able to interpret printed words into spoken words. And the second part is language comprehension, and that's, of course, being able to understand the spoken language. So this is represented as a multiplication equation because both word identification and language comprehension are equally important. And then the idea is if you had a 0, if this was numbers, if you had a 0 in either place, you'd get a 0 over in reading comprehension, which I think makes intuitive sense. If you can't actually identify the words on the page, it doesn't matter how strong your language comprehension skills are, you're not going to be able to comprehend what you've read. And the same thing is true in the opposite way. If you imagine if I was able to sound out words, like if I was reading Spanish or something like that, but I don't actually understand Spanish, so I would still get a 0 for reading comprehension. So we're going to talk about both of these pieces and what we can do to support kids, but we're going to start with word identification because dyslexia is considered a learning disability in word identification. So this is the primary area where individuals with dyslexia need the most support, but they also need support with language comprehension. So we will come back to that piece. So what does the science tell us about how we learn to identify words? So again, this resource here, this picture is taken from this resource, The Science of Reading, a Primer, which is a free online resource, which is linked on this slide. I don't know if I can get the link and stick it in the chat or not. Oops, I just pressed on it. It's going to take me there. Hang on, sorry. I shouldn't have clicked on the link. You know what, I'll share the slides in the end if anybody is interested in going to that, going to check out that resource. It's a free little ebook that gives a lot more information about the science of reading than I can possibly do this evening. But I did pull out these two graphics because I think they're great for illustrating this point. So this is a very crude drawing of what the brain looks like before a person learns to read. So the white here, these white nodes, and this darker blue, this is the oral language center of the brain, and the darker blue is the center of the brain that deals with meaning and context and integrating information. And even in babies, these two parts of the brain, the meaning and the oral language part of the brain, are very, very integrated. But this lighter blue square back over here, this is the visual input part of the brain. And before a person learns to read, there really is not a very good set of connections between this visual input and this oral and the meaning processing center of the brain. But what they have discovered by using fMRIs on the brains of lots of people who can read and who can't, that as people learn to read, they actually develop this center in the brain that I've heard called the brain's letterbox that connects the visual input of letters on the page to the sound and meaning processing centers of the brain. And these connections develop as a person learns to read. But the important point to know here is that this is not a developmental phase that will spontaneously happen, like, learning to walk or something. Like these connections are built actively through the process of learning to read. And they see in brain scans of people who, even adult dyslexics don't have a very well developed set of connections here. But if they receive remediation and they receive like over an extended period of time, these connections will start to form as they become better readers, so they can actually rewire the brain. So that is super exciting. Individuals with dyslexia, the difference is it takes a lot longer to form these connections. That is really that's what dyslexia is. So how do we form these connections, and how can we help people form these connections? So again, this is a very simplified overview of how this works, but it's a good and important thing to know. And there's a lot of science behind this as well, that these connections in the brain are actually formed through the process of sounding out words. So when a reader comes to a word that they don't know, if they slow down and they carefully attend to all of the letters in the word and connect those letters to the sounds that they represent by applying their knowledge of letter sound associations and English spelling patterns, because as we know, English is very complicated. So there's actually a lot of things that you need to know to be able to accurately decode a word that way. And then if the person has that word in their oral language vocabulary, so they've got something for it to hook onto, then that word can be stored in their brain in a way that it makes it instantly recognizable for them in the future. So I'm sure for most of the people on the call tonight, if you looked at the word cat, you didn't need to slow down and sound it out. You just looked at it and you knew it was cat. And that's because at some point in the past, probably when you were a little kid, you probably sounded out the word cat a few times, and then it was stored and you've never had to think about the word cat again. And that is really important, that instant word recognition piece. Because to become a skilled reader, you need to have a large bank of words that are stored in your brain this way for instant recall. And that allows you to fluently read and quickly read. And it also frees up the rest of your working memory and the rest of your brain power for comprehension, for thinking about what you're reading. So a lot of times, we might imagine that a child has a comprehension issue because they sort of struggled through reading it and they get to the end and they can't tell you what they've read. If you were to read the passage to the child and they totally understood it, then they don't have a comprehension issue. They have a word recognition and a fluency issue. So that's a really important piece, because often we'll try, or we see that kids are being encouraged to use different comprehension strategies because it's imagine that is the issue, when in fact, what they need to do is they need to become fluent readers so that they can free up their brain power to thinking about what they've read. So this is very important for individuals with dyslexia. And this is actually very important for supporting all readers, because another important finding of the science of reading is that everyone actually learns to read this way. It's not like there are multiple ways that people learn to read. This is how we learn to read. So if a child or I should say, one of the reasons that a lot of children are slow to learn to read is because when they are reading, they're not slowing down and sounding out words. And this is true for dyslexic kids and non-dyslexic kids. If it's a kid that's encouraged to guess based on the context of the story, picture cues, maybe just looking at the first letter, looking at the general shape of the word, that is not enough for those words to be stored in that way that makes those connections in the brain so that it is recognizable to them in the future. So we really need to be encouraging all kids to be slowing down and sounding out words. So individuals with dyslexia have problems with two aspects of that model that I just showed. The first aspect that they have problems with is learning the skills that you need to have to sound out words, because as I said, English is complicated, right? Like there's a lot going on in the English language. And there are a few different sets of skills that need to be all automatic and mastered so that you can actually sound out English words. So the first thing that kids need to be able to do, and I shouldn't say the first thing like these things are sequential and you learn them in order, like kids learn them together, but there's 3 parts. They need to be able to identify and manipulate the individual sounds in the words, because the process of storing those words relies on mapping the sound to the printed letters that represent that sound. So if you're having difficulty identifying the individual sounds correctly, like maybe the child isn't quite hearing the difference between vowel sounds, ah and ih or something, then they're not going to be consistently mapping the letters to the right sound, and then they're going to have problems remembering it. Also, sometimes kids might be fine with the individual sounds, but they have problems blending those sounds together to make the word. So those are considered difficulties with phonemic and phonological awareness. And that is very typical of individuals with dyslexia, have great challenges with that. But again, with proper instruction, that can be overcome. They also have difficulty mastering letter sound associations. So it will take them longer to get to the point where they automatically know that the letter A might say ah. One thing that can be really helpful here is to integrate writing into the learning the letter sound associations. So very often we might be inclined to be doing a lot of reading where you're looking at the letters, making the sounds. If you also integrate the reverse of that, so saying the sound to the child and asking them to write down the letter, it really helps to cement that learning so that they can master those letter sound associations. And then learning spelling patterns. And again, spelling patterns in English are complicated. There's a lot of them, but there are a lot of resources that are available that create a sort of comprehensive sequence that is logical, where you start with the easiest spelling patterns and you teach those, and then you move on to the more complicated spelling patterns. And when it's broken down that way, individuals with dyslexia can learn to decode and sound out words. But they do need a lot more instruction in that to be successful. And then the second issue that we have is that, and I say we because I didn't actually disclose at the beginning that I'm dyslexic myself, but the second issue that we have is that we need more time to practice sounding out a word before it's stored for instant recall. So again, with that diagram that I showed, you sound out the word a few times and it gets stored. The statistics I've seen on this is that individuals who don't have dyslexia need to sound out a word between 1 and 4 times before it's stored for that instant future recall, and they'll have it forever. They'll never have to sound it out again. But individuals with dyslexia, and again, depending on the severity of the dyslexia, would need to sound out a word 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe more times. So they really need a lot of practice and a lot of supported practice applying the specific spelling patterns that they've learned and the specific letter sound associations that they have learned, so that they really get cemented. So this is just sort of to recap, like we have difficulties with learning how to decode words, and we need more practice. So what do we need? Well, individuals with dyslexia need explicit systematic instruction in those decoding skills, and lots of practice applying those skills to sounding out words. So there's a lot to, as I said, English is very complex. There's a lot to it. So we do have on our website and on our YouTube channel, which I sent out before, we do have a number of free pre-recorded webinars, which really go through breaking down the complexity of English into a manageable scope and sequence, so that a parent, we have 2 that are two webinars, this pictured here, pre-recorded webinar, Helping Your Struggling Reader. This is a 2-part series. This one is intended for parents. And then we also have one for teachers. It's a 3-part series explaining how to do it with the whole class. But in these videos, both of them, I should say, also have free downloadable printable resources that show you how to teach word decoding in a systematic and explicit way so that kids can be successful with it. The other piece that I mentioned is that we need opportunities to practice, and this is where decodable books come in. And I know that the library has recently received or is getting decodable books, because that was a part of a program that IDA did recently. But decodable books, just to explain what they are, I'm going to start with a non-decodable book, and then I can show you a decodable book. So this is an example of a typical early reader that I'm sure everybody's kind of familiar with. And these early readers are leveled based on typically sentence length, and that the topic of the book is fairly easy. And the idea is that kids will read these, and as they're reading them, they will learn words to read. And this works well for a lot of kids, but it's difficult for kids with dyslexia. So here's an example. This is a level 1 from this particular series, which I know is different than the leveling systems they use at school, but simple text: Pinky and I will take long walks, chase butterflies, and play fetch. So if you think about it, like, that seems fairly easy, but what are all of the different pieces of English phonics and code that you need to know to be able to actually decode the words on this page? You'd need to know 14 different consonants. You'd need to know short vowels, like in the I in the word will. You'd need to know long E, spelled Y as in pinky. You'd need to know the long A sound, spelled A consonant E as in take. You'd need to know long A spelled another way, spelled AY as in play. And then you also have the letter A pronounced aw as in walk. And then there's 2 different spellings of the digraph ch. There's CH as in chase and TCH as in fetch. And then you also have a multisyllabic word, butterflies. So that's a mouthful to actually blend together to get through that long of a word and then blend all the sounds together. So again, for a typically developing reader, this might be fine. They might be able to read this and then intuit some of these spelling patterns from reading these things over and over again, seeing words like take and make. They may just be able to figure out that when you see an A and then an E, that it's a long A. But kids with dyslexia will not intuit these things through reading books like this. Even if they read them over and over and over again, they might memorize them. They might memorize a lot of words, but they really don't intuit the spelling patterns from books like this. The type of book, the decodable book, on the other hand, is organized usually as a part of a series where they're introducing individual sound spelling relationships in each step of the series. And then they're layering on more and more and more as you work your way through the series. And then at each sort of step of the way, they also have a handful of high frequency words that are taught directly. So the kid isn't coming to a word they've never seen before and then being, thinking that maybe they should just guess at it, or they're actually taught those words as well. So this book that I chose as an example, this series, is a free series that was put out by the Specific Learning Disabilities Association of Australia. You can find it, all of the books, all 10 sets of books, and each set has at least a dozen books, if not more, in each set. This is a book that is a part of set 2, so that means that it contains only the sound spellings in set 1 and set 2, as well as a small number of high frequency words. And I like this series because each book has with it a practice page that you can start with your child before reading. So you would point to the letter, and the child would have then say the sound that letter represents. Go through practicing all of the different letters that are included in the book. And then they have a chance to practice blending the sounds together to make words. So that's another chance that they're sounding out these words. And then a chance to practice the high frequency words that are not necessarily decodable to the child yet. Some of the words are truly irregular. Others are words that are just very high utility, and they're introduced earlier on just so that you can have a story, because it's very difficult to write a whole story with just these letters up here. And then all of the words in the text are ones that the child, when they get to the word, they can successfully sound it out. And that's really the beauty of these books, is that because the kids have been explicitly taught these letter sound combinations, hopefully they've been integrating that writing and speaking together, and they've become reasonably automatic with these, and then they are able to, when they get to the text, successfully sound it out, and it's that success that is amazing to see. So that is decodable text. Before I get on to the next part here, does anybody have any questions? I was going to go into language comprehension.
I have a quick question. Denise, I think, anticipated it too, because I teach French as well. So how does, I imagine that it becomes so difficult. You know, I've had come up against the attitude that, oh, you know, those kids just can't learn. They can't learn French. They shouldn't even be in the French class. What is your response to that?
Oh, my response to that is they absolutely can be in the French class if they're supported correctly. We actually did a webinar specifically on French immersion and dyslexia last February, and you can find that recording on our YouTube channel as well. It is definitely more difficult, but if you're using a structured approach, kids with dyslexia can learn to read well in French and in English. My own son, actually, who is severely dyslexic, is in French immersion, and it was not easy. It was a long slog, but we did support him, and he has learned to read well in both French and English. And again, because dyslexia is a word identification disability or difficulty, learning to do the decoding piece, like that is transferable, right? Like the skill of learning to read is transferable from English to French. It's the vocabulary and language in French that's adding on an extra layer of difficulty. So the kids are going to struggle with learning to read in both English and French, like with the word identification piece. But some of them are actually fine at picking up speaking in French. So if they're doing that and the child is enjoying it, then they should just be supported, and they should be able to be successful. We also, for teachers that are teaching in French, we also have a webinar we have a couple webinars on our YouTube channel that show how to teach decoding systematically in French. And we're doing a workshop soon, like a half-day workshop with a French linguist that's going through the pieces of French phonics, because it is a little bit different, but they can be supported in both languages.
If I can just add to that, Denise, because I do work completely in French, and because it's in Ontario, often what we were seeing is what you were touching on, is that we think, oh, it's because they don't have the language. And then these kind of early intervention get pushed because we feel that we're saying that it's because they don't have the language. I think what I'm getting from tonight is that you can do some early assessments, and I don't have the English words, some early assessments to kind of decipher what's going on, because it would show up in French and in English, what we're talking about this evening. With the piece that I feel in the French language, and I don't teach immersion, I teach in a French language 100%, is the piece where you say they cannot connect it to an image. It's the vocabulary. And I'm at the point in my career, like I teach grade 5, 6, I say, I kind of feel like certain kids should have learned in English first and then transferred into a second language if French is not their language. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like I feel that if the vocabulary is larger in English, for example, starting them off in that language and then possibly going into French immersion to transfer would be more effective. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't really seen a lot of research on that. So I would hate to sort of speculate and just kind of give my opinion. What I can say is that the research shows that the decoding piece is transferable. So, and also if they get help, like if they're in a French immersion program, a French early program, and they're receiving help in English, that it actually transfers to what they're learning in French. But yes, it's the vocabulary. The other issue actually that we see, and I've talked to a number of French teachers about this, is that the books that we're using in Ontario to teach French to non-Francophones, like the J.B. Plus books and things like that, are very often books that have vocabulary that is way beyond these kids, right? Whereas if you take, if you do decodable books in French, like there are some series, there's one from Quebec called Facile à lire, which I'm sure I'm saying that horribly, but those ones introduce vocabulary and decoding at the same time, starting off with simpler words. So, you know, that is a way to support that as well. But yes, absolutely, like you need to have the vocabulary so that there's something for it to stick with. So if you're expecting that kids are going to be able to just take, that are not Francophone, are going to be able to take direct translations of the English books in French and learn to read that way, it's just not going to work, right? So that's kind of my thought on that. Usually when I talk to parents with kids that are in French immersion, it's got to be a personal choice. I don't think there's any blanket rule. It really depends on the kid. It depends on their motivation and their interest in being in French. It depends on their French language comprehension, like if they've got support at home. But if they want to participate in the French program, they absolutely can, as long as they get adequate support. And if the support's not available in French, we say to just support in English, teach them to decode in English, and at least the decoding skills transfer. They just have to learn the French phonemes as well, right? Anybody else?
Sorry, so this is not French, but what about ELLs then? Is there like, I imagine that so long as they have a really good basis in their, you know, L1, right? Then, and depending on how it is, like for example, Mandarin is completely different, right? But so long as they have a good foundation in their L1 with the phonics, or I'm sure I'm not using this right, but you know, the link of the letter and the sound, then that transfers over as well, right?
Yeah. Yes. So there's a lot of research to show that English language learners or second English as a second language or additional language, whatever you want to call it, students, when they're struggling, often their struggles are being attributed to the language issue, when in fact there is an underlying issue of dyslexia, right? So if they're also struggling to decode in their primary language, that should be a big warning sign, and we should be assessing dyslexia and providing dyslexia support instead of just attributing it to the language comprehension issue of English. And they can be supported at home in their first language to learn how to decode words in their first language, and those decoding skills will transfer. Like they also need to be taught English decoding and how the English spelling system works and that sort of thing. But that is transferable. But that's a big problem. Actually, we just published a research report this past week, and we were looking at the reading achievement of English. Well, it's labeled English language learners by the Ontario government, but I really don't like that term. We were looking at the reading achievement and the identification of learning disabilities in English language learners in Ontario is so low. So we're identifying 10 English as a first language students for every 1 English as a second language student who is getting an official learning disabilities diagnosis. So we are really missing those kids when we know that that dyslexia or learning disabilities are universal. They affect both groups equally, but we're missing it in those kids very often because their challenges are being attributed to simply a language comprehension issue when really there is that underlying decoding issue. Anybody else, or should I just go on with the last little bit? I just have a couple more slides. Is it okay? Because I realize now I'm just looking at the time and it's 7 o'clock now.
That's fine.
Is it okay if we go a few minutes longer?
Absolutely.
Okay. Sorry about that. I got a little excited and off track when I got to talk about the right to read inquiry. As I mentioned before, oral language is also, it's equally important to decoding when it comes to reading comprehension. And oral language or language comprehension starts orally, like it starts in pre-readers, you know, and this I think we all know, when kids are read to at home through playing games and singing, you know, and different imaginative play, and but also through experiences that they have in the wider world. So if they're being taken out by their families or on field trips in school to museums and science centers, or having the ability to play sports. All of these things help to build language comprehension because there's vocabulary that goes on with each and every one of these things. There's a very famous and interesting study called the baseball study that's been replicated many times, where they've taken children who are at various reading levels, you know, strong readers, poor readers, and then they also asked the kids ahead of time how much they knew about baseball. And then they had all of the kids read a passage that was describing what was happening in a baseball game. And they gave them a little board with all the pieces on it, and they had them move the pieces around to represent what was happening in the game so that they could measure the reading comprehension of the kids. And they found that the kids who were really knowledgeable about baseball had much better reading comprehension than or I should say the poor readers, like the poor decoders, who were really knowledgeable about baseball, had a much better reading comprehension than the very strong readers who didn't know anything about baseball. So this is just to say that early reading comprehension or early language comprehension really comes from a whole variety of sources. And again, this is in pre-readers. It comes from a whole variety of sources. But as kids get older and they go through school, we say that they transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And once kids can read, their language comprehension skills start to skyrocket, because through picking up books and reading, you have the ability to explore all sorts of different subjects and ideas that you wouldn't necessarily be able to explore in your own community or in your own household, different topics and ideas. Also, the language that's used in print is much more complex than the language that occurs in speech. There's a larger variety of words, a bigger vocabulary, and certainly much more complex sentence structure. So if kids are struggling with decoding early and they're not making the transition from learning to read to reading to learn at the same point as the other children, which is going to be the case for kids with dyslexia, because it does take them longer to build those connections and become efficient decoders. This is a problem because, they're not able to continue growing their language comprehension ability on that same grade level trajectory as the other kids. It becomes a barrier, and we sort of call this the grade 3 wall for a lot of kids. So kids with dyslexia, if they're struggling with decoding, we absolutely need to be getting them help with decoding. But we need to recognize that the text that they're going to be working on isn't necessarily at the same level as their language comprehension. So we need to make sure that they're still able to access text that is at their language comprehension ability and will help them to grow their language comprehension abilities. And that's where audiobooks and assistive technology can be really helpful to allow them to continue to grow their oral language and their language development skills while we are working on the reading, bringing up their decoding abilities into the same level. And that is it for my formal presentation. This is some information. This is Dyslexia Awareness Month. October is Dyslexia Awareness Month, and we're running a campaign called Read October, which is a readathon in support of dyslexia awareness, and it is also the program that allowed us to connect with the Gravenhurst Library and help them purchase some decodable books. So I would encourage everyone to check out Read October if they have a chance and get involved in that. But I do have time. I'm going to stop the share. I do have time for questions if anybody has any more questions that they would like to ask.